In cities across the country, once vibrant Chinatowns are struggling to maintain their identities, with populations down dramatically in the last 30 years. Gentrification and real estate development threaten these enclaves, once the only place for immigrants as far back as the 1700s to call home in America. In one of the most anticipated books of this fall, Everything I Learned in a Chinese Restaurant, author Curtis Chin details these forces through his own journey, growing up inside his family's restaurant in Detroit.
Welcome to Chung's. Is this for here to go? That's how my dad greeted any new face who entered the lobby of our popular Chinese restaurant in Detroit.
It is also how Curtis Chin greets readers at the beginning of his uniquely American coming-of-age story.
Our 94-seat dining room was the happiest place on earth. Chung's had it all.
Everything I learned in a Chinese restaurant.
My mom didn't graduate high school. My dad went to community college for maybe a couple semesters. But in that dining room was this whole world of people that could open up the world to us.
For 60 years, Curtis Chin's family nourished the city of Detroit with Chinese and Chinese-American classics.
This is sweet and sour chicken, breaded fried shrimp.
Pork fried rice.
Yeah. So almond boneless chicken is a Detroit dish.
Oh my God. Yeah. I know why I ate this all the time.
Yeah, but this was our best-selling dish at our restaurant.
His father's mom, his Yin, spent 2 days making the egg rolls.
This is not your grandmother's egg roll. Mm-hmm. But what was so special about it? Do you remember?
So over the course of 60 years, we actually sold over 10 million egg rolls. And I know because my mom was helping my grandmother and she counted. I mean, because they basically knew how many they have to make per week.
Oh my God.
Chinese restaurants are part of the American fabric. With food, it always elicits fond memories, good things. And so I'm happy, I was very proud to be a Chinese restaurant kid. Salty and savory, sugary and spicy.
It's a place where, as Chin writes, using your indoor voice meant yelling at the top of your lungs.
So each time I ran into the kitchen and called to my dad, "Customer!"
And every day was Take Your Kid to Work Day. Born in the aftermath of the Detroit riots in 1967,
tanks patrol the streets of Detroit.
Chung's was also the place where he learned about the world.
Every time the front door opened, I looked up in anticipation. The idea of being in that space and just meeting people and never knowing who's going to walk in that front door. It really shaped who I was.
Chung's was a melting pot in a segregated city, hosting everyone from the city's first black mayor, Coleman Young, to the star of The King and I, actor Yul Brynner.
During the day, it was very white-collar professionals, and in the evening, lower-income people, frankly, a lot of drug dealers, prostitutes and things like that. Obviously, the diversity of people, white, black, Jewish, Christian, it was a very diverse city, and they all came in through our doors.
A diverse mix of people in a complicated time for the city, with an auto industry on the decline and violence growing at an alarming rate.
I personally knew 5 people murdered by the time I was 18 years old,
including Vincent Chin.
Vincent was a family friend. This was in the early 80s during the height of the anti-Japanese sentiment. He was a Chinese American going out to celebrate his upcoming wedding.
He was killed by 2 white auto workers. The pair were eventually convicted, but their punishment was a mere $3,000 fine and no jail time.
It was really disappointing to me that the media wasn't paying attention.
I don't remember it. I didn't know of it until I read the book.
It took 12 days before the media actually covered it and wrote a story about it. And then when the judge came down with the sentence, that's when people were shocked by it. But in some ways, the playing field had already been leveled, right? Because people didn't know about the Chinese community or the Asian community. They didn't see us as people.
We want justice!
And so that was my first inkling that I thought maybe I should be a writer. Maybe I should be one of those people that, helps tell our community stories.
But before Curtis Chin could tell those stories, he needed to come to terms with part of his own.
Trying to understand, accept, and establish my own identity by race, class, and sexuality was difficult, especially when these intersections contradicted and collided.
When did you first realize that you were gay?
When I met this other kid named Rudy, a Filipino boy who grew up in Chinatown too. I didn't know what it was, but I knew I really liked him. A few years later, that's when I knew it was more of a physical thing. It definitely felt it was something different, yeah.
Fearful of the exploding AIDS epidemic and homophobia, he struggled coming to terms with his sexuality into his 20s.
I never had a fear that my family was going to kick me out. My fear was disappointing my family, making them unhappy. I always say this, that, even though I don't work in a Chinese restaurant now, I am perpetually the Chinese waiter. I live my life trying to make people happy, including my family. And that kept me in the closet probably a little bit longer than I could have. At the end of the day, the most important person that you need to come out to is yourself. They would have been fine with it. I had to be fine with it, though.
Part of making his parents happy included going to college. Chin studied poetry at the University of Michigan and became a screenwriter.
I never liked the idea of being a model minority.
But in recent years, he's turned to social justice with documentaries. And now with his book.
A few years ago, when my siblings started having kids, I started thinking like, oh my God, they're not going to know about this whole history that our family had since the late 1800s coming to Detroit. I wanted to share that part of our family history with them. It was only after COVID hit and, George Floyd was murdered and, you had this rise of anti-Asian hate crimes that I started thinking that, well, maybe there's something about this story that actually might be more relevant to more people.
His father sold Chung's 23 years ago.
So this was the main entrance on Cass. We had a nice bright red door.
But the building is still there, vacant all these years later.
You can look in there.
Oh, wow.
I don't know if the lighting is good enough, but it's completely empty. This was the kitchen, and I could tell, and this was where the fry cook was at the end, because it was cooler, because we opened the door, and this is where the almond boneless chicken is, this is where the egg foo youngs, this is where I hung out.
And while he chose to leave Detroit,
it is hard, but I also know that I made a choice to leave. I mean, that's the opening line of my book, right? For here to go, right? And that's a choice that I had to make.
with his stories, Chin is keeping Chinatown and his family's part in it alive.
I realized that Big Al hadn't brought us into the dining room to give Grandma a break, or even to protect the restaurant. He had really brought us there to discover the outside world, which is sitting right at our tables. All we had to do was listen.
And for me, reading it, obviously from Detroit, it really touched something in me. But also, I remember those Chinese food meals once a week. That was something in our family. I think for a lot of families, as they talk about Chung's welcoming everybody in, you can relate to that part of it. His story really is one of coming of age. His family doesn't have that restaurant anymore. His cousin has Chin's in Livonia, which was where we were able to eat and made that fabulous meal for us. There really is something about it. I can't quite explain it, but when you read the book, everybody probably has a little touchstone to it.
Mm. And you got a lot of history that I didn't know. I mean, the killing of Vincent Chin that you talked about. You didn't know about that. You lived there.
I lived there.
I didn't either.
Yeah, there are. That's what I mean. There are moments in it. It's really a beautiful story.
And I love that opening line. For here to go.
Or to go.
What a great book opening line.
Yeah.
Nice job, Dana.